In 1962, Brian Epstein walked into my office with a record of this group called the Beatles, which I thought was such a stupid name.
When fans think of George Martin, they picture a man who helped make the Beatles sound amazing. But George Martin was much more than just someone who recorded their music. He was the person who helped the Beatles learn how to make better songs and use new sounds that no one had tried before in the 1960s. George Martin worked most closely with Paul McCartney, who was the member of the Beatles who liked to be in charge and always had big ideas. From the very beginning, Paul and George didn't always agree on things, but they learned to work together in a special way. The story started on June 6, 1962, when the Beatles came to a recording studio in London for the first time. George Martin was the man in charge of deciding if they were good enough to make records. While John Lennon was quiet and George Harrison didn't say much, Paul McCartney was different. He walked around asking questions about how everything worked and had lots of ideas about how their songs should sound. George Martin wasn't used to this. Most singers he worked with just did what he told them to do. But Paul was full of ideas and wanted to be part of making decisions. Right away, they disagreed about their first song called Love Me Do. George Martin thought it was too simple, but Paul really liked it. In the end, they recorded it the way George Martin suggested, and surprisingly, it became popular on the radio. One of the first big decisions George Martin made was asking the band to get a new drummer. He thought Pete Best, their old drummer, wasn't good enough. He wanted them to use Ringo Starr instead. Paul didn't like this idea at first, but he eventually agreed. This showed that George Martin was willing to make tough choices to help the band get better. During those early days, George Martin would write notes after each recording session. He wrote special notes about Paul, talking about how good he was at making up melodies and how hard he worked. But he also noticed that Paul always wanted to be in control, which was unusual for someone so young. George Martin once said that Paul was the only person who made him feel like he had to prove why an idea wouldn't work. They had small fights about things like how fast a song should be or what key it should be in. But even when they disagreed, they were starting to respect each other. Paul didn't always do what George Martin said, but he listened. George Martin didn't give up his ideas easily, but he tried to explain things in a way that made sense instead of just getting angry. Their relationship wasn't built on being friends or thinking the same way. Instead, they learned to accept that they were very different people who could help each other make better music. As time went on, they stopped fighting about who was in charge and started using each other's strengths to make music that was better than what most bands were making. Between 1965 and 1967, the Beatles made their best music. Albums like Rubber Soul, Revolver, and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band showed that they weren't just a regular band anymore. They were like artists in a studio, trying new things that no one had done before. During this time, Paul McCartney and George Martin figured out how to work together in an amazing way. Paul would come to the studio not just with songs, but with ideas about how they should sound. He might want strings or horns or weird effects. George Martin didn't fight these ideas. Instead, he figured out how to make Paul's crazy ideas actually work in real life. For example, when Paul brought in a song called Eleanor Rigby, it was just a simple folk song. George Martin suggested they get rid of all of the regular instruments like guitars and drums and use only string instruments instead. The result was a song that sounded like it belonged in a movie, but still felt like a pop song. When they made For No One, George Martin let Paul record almost the whole song by himself, but he said they needed to add a French horn to make it sound fuller. When Paul wasn't sure how to do this, George Martin wrote out the music by hand and brought in a professional horn player from a big orchestra. He made the musician do exactly 4 tries at recording it, no more, because he believed that having limits kept songs from getting too complicated. For A Day in the Life, Paul and John had 2 different pieces of songs that didn't connect. George Martin didn't ask them to change the songs, but he came up with the idea of connecting them with a big orchestra playing a rising sound for 24 beats. During the recording, he let the orchestra members wear masks and funny hats while they played, but he carefully controlled how loud everything was and made sure the final chord lasted almost a minute without sounding bad. During this time, Paul and George Martin worked like 2 parts of the same machine. Paul would have an idea and ask, "What if we did this?" And George Martin would figure out if it was possible and how to make it work. Even when they disagreed, it was never personal. When Paul wanted to use backward tape sounds in Rain, George Martin didn't say no, but he wanted to test it first to see how it sounded. Paul agreed, and in the end they used the backward sound, but in a careful way, not just randomly. But not everything was easy. Paul often came up with ideas that were too complicated or would take too much time. Sometimes he would show up at the studio with a few chords written on a napkin and ask George Martin to arrange a whole song by the end of the day. George Martin never said no, but he always made a deal. If there wasn't enough time to do everything perfectly, they would make it simpler. This became their rule. They would try crazy things, but within limits that made sense. This time period wasn't just when the Beatles made their best music, it also showed how a producer could be like a creative partner, not just someone who pressed buttons on machines. George Martin didn't try to make the music sound like his own ideas. Instead, he helped Paul's ideas become real songs that sounded professional. Their success came not because they were similar, but because they accepted that being different was actually helpful for making good music. But this perfect balance started to fall apart when Paul began taking even more control, and the cooperation between creativity and control became harder to manage. When the Beatles made the White Album, everything changed. This album took almost 5 months to make and had 30 songs that were all completely different from each other. Most of the songs were made by individual Beatles members working alone, not as a group. George Martin, who used to organize everything, gradually lost his central role. Instead of working with the whole band on songs, he had to work with individual members on separate tracks, often without knowing ahead of time when they would need him. During this time, Paul McCartney wanted even more control. He would come in with songs already arranged the way he wanted them, ask for private recording sessions, play multiple instruments himself, and sometimes even record with a different engineer when George Martin wasn't there. Some songs like Martha, My Dear were completed entirely without any other Beatles members being there at all. George Martin didn't complain, but you could tell he was getting tired. When reporters asked him about making this album, he simply said they were no longer a band and he was no longer the director. Jeff Emmerich, who had been their sound engineer for years, actually quit in the middle of making the album. Paul had demanded that they re-record the bass part of a song completely because he didn't like how it sounded, while John and George weren't even there. Jeff felt overwhelmed and like his work wasn't being respected anymore, so he left on the spot. George Martin didn't try to stop him because he saw this as a sign that their old way of working together had broken down. The problems in the studio showed what was happening to the band in general. They were disagreeing about music, business, and personal things. Paul, maybe trying to keep the creative energy going, pushed even harder for control over the final product. But instead of leading the band forward, he was working alone in a situation where George Martin was no longer keeping everything organized. One notable moment happened when Paul presented a recording of Obladi, Oblada, and asked George Martin to redo the entire track with a new arrangement. The first version was disliked by John, and George Martin didn't respond right away. After many attempts and rejections, John finally came into the studio, sat at the piano, and played the beginning his own way without being asked. Paul surprisingly agreed, and George Martin re-recorded the song in just one session. It was one of the few times during this period when they worked together effectively, and it happened by accident, not through planning. After the White Album, George Martin was barely involved in the Let It Be project. The whole filming and recording process was given to a separate production team. When the original version got stuck, the band brought in Phil Spector, who was known for his wall of sound technique, to finish the product. Paul initially agreed to try to save the project, but after hearing the final mix, he reacted badly. The string arrangements in the long and winding road sounded too heavy and didn't match the song. Paul called George Martin and said, "I don't recognize my song anymore." George Martin replied, "You gave it away, Paul." That was one of the rare times George Martin voiced a clear opinion about a product he hadn't produced. But he didn't attack anyone personally, and he didn't try to take back control. From that point on, he began turning down some Beatles-related projects, not because he was angry, but because he understood what no longer belonged to him. After all the problems, no one was sure if George Martin and Paul McCartney could ever work together again. But once everything was separated from the Beatles name, the two began working together again, this time as two independent people, no longer bound by their shared history. When the Beatles officially broke up in 1970, many relationships ended with them. But between George Martin and Paul McCartney, working together didn't stop. It just changed into a different form. They continued to work together on several later projects, no longer bound by the group structure or internal pressures, and no longer subject to the unspoken hierarchy that once existed within the Beatles. Their relationship was no longer that of a producer and a band member, but of two experienced individuals, each holding a distinct role in an open creative process. In 1973, Paul was invited to write the theme song for Live and Let Die, one of the most successful James Bond movies. He asked George Martin to produce the song. This was the first time since Abbey Road that they worked together in a structured way. There was no John, no George Harrison, no Abbey Road studio. The situation had changed, but their roles stayed the same. Paul brought in the theme idea with a finished chorus. George Martin handled the orchestration, put together a large group of musicians, and managed the entire transition between the song's contrasting musical segments. The result was a recording more structurally complex than most previous James Bond themes, and it came to be considered a highlight of 1970s film music. This collaboration marked the beginning of a new phase. In the 1980s, Paul was looking for a new musical direction after his time with his bandwings. George Martin, now in his 50s, still worked carefully, writing down every arrangement and checking each beat. They created the album Tug of War in 1982, followed by Pipes of Peace in 1983. Free from the tension of the Beatles' environment, the production went smoothly, almost like the ideal working method they had once hoped for. George Martin's involvement went beyond technical work. He gave input on song selection, on the album's overarching themes, and on the choice of guest musicians. For Tug of War, he was the one who suggested inviting Stevie Wonder to sing on What's That You're Doing, an unexpected move that showed George Martin was willing to expand the scope of collaboration as long as Paul had faith in it. The album was later praised by critics as Paul's finest work since leaving the Beatles. There was no conventional friendship between the two. They rarely appeared together in public and shared little personal information with the media, but those close to them said they stayed in regular contact, often through handwritten letters or phone calls. Giles Martin, George's son, once said in an interview, "My dad had a separate shelf just for Paul's demo tapes, not to keep them as souvenirs, but because he liked knowing Paul was still writing music." Though their collaborations had become less frequent, George Martin always expressed admiration for Paul in interviews. When asked which artist had taught him the most through working together, he didn't hesitate to name Paul. He knew exactly what he wanted. "The challenge was for me to find a way to make that happen within real time and limits." In an industry often full of conflict between creativity and production, the collaboration that lasted more than 3 decades between George Martin and Paul McCartney was a rare exception. It wasn't perfect or smooth, but it was strong. It didn't rely on friendship or loyalty, but on the ability of both to maintain boundaries and to respect the work that lay beyond those boundaries. When George Martin passed away, Paul didn't hold a big public memorial. But what he said and didn't say in the years that followed showed that George Martin's influence went beyond the recordings into the very way Paul continued to see himself as an artist. George Martin passed away on March 8, 2016, at the age of 90. In his first public statement, Paul McCartney called him a true gentleman, a genius producer, and a second father. It was a brief but meaningful farewell, not only because of their collaboration that lasted more than half a century, but also because Paul rarely offered such personal descriptions of those he had worked with. Not long after, Paul held a private memorial at a small chapel in Oxfordshire. There was no press, no speeches, just a piano, a few loved ones, and an unreleased recording that played at the end, a 1981 demo edited by George Martin himself, with a handwritten note on the sleeve, unfinished, but honest. From that point on, George Martin began to appear more often in Paul's interviews, not through praise, but as a point of reference. When discussing recording techniques, Paul often mentioned how George Martin handled orchestration or balanced volume between traditional and electronic instruments. When speaking of songwriting decisions, he recalled moments when George Martin rejected an idea, not because he lacked belief, but because he needed time to think it through again. The way Paul described George Martin didn't sound like someone who had passed away, but rather like a system of thought he still used. In 2022, during a conversation with Giles Martin, Paul shared that he still heard George's voice whenever he wrote music. "Sometimes I plan to put a string section at the end of a song, and I hear him in my head. Are you doing this to serve the song or to show off?" That question, according to Paul, made him think about his real reasons each time he began writing. That presence also shaped the way Paul responded to new technologies. Starting in 2023, as artificial intelligence began to be used to recreate the voices and musical styles of deceased artists, Paul was among the first to speak out about ethical boundaries. In a hearing before the UK Parliament, he stated, "The real voice doesn't lie in frequency. It lies in timing, in context, and in its relationship with the listener. A recording can't be separated from the person behind it, even if that person is no longer here." When asked about the possibility of bringing George Martin back through AI, he shook his head. "You can't. We used to sit in silence together through many sessions. A machine can't understand the necessity of those silences. Some of George Martin's notes released by his family after his passing revealed unpublished thoughts about Paul. In one handwritten passage without a date, he wrote, "Paul is not easy to work with. But it's precisely his instability that stopped me from being careless. If he asked too much, it's because he feared falling short of what the music demanded." On another page, George Martin wrote a shorter remark: "I coordinated the process." He carried the reason for the process to exist. No farewell letter was ever sent. No official final words were released. But in those details, from how Paul reacted when speaking of George Martin to how George Martin spoke of him in unpublished notes, lies a relationship not built on emotion-filled moments, but sustained through the way each held the other to a higher standard. The collaboration between Paul McCartney and George Martin was not a tale of friendship, nor simply the relationship between an artist and a producer. It was the parallel existence of two value systems, one conceptual, one structural, that somehow found common ground. They did not always agree. They clashed, stepped back, worked separately, but never once did they deny each other's role in their creative journey. And when only one remained, the presence of the other continued in the clearest form as an irreplaceable reference point in how a song should be made.